The secret to a good YouTube video is not about the speaker or the content or the lighting. It is solely 100% based on how much coffee you ingest before recording. So what's going on, everybody? Dom here from Lensprotogo and Lens Rentals. No, I'm just kidding. But we have some pretty exciting stuff for you here today. What you see in front of you is the Vazen T2 1.8x Anamorphic prime lens set in RF mount. This 28mm is actually a T2.2, but it sounds a lot cleaner the way I said it. So if you were thinking RED Komodo with those anamorphic modes, or even the R5 with that 8K video mode, those are all going to be total possibilities with this native RF connection that we got going on. So that's the exciting stuff I was talking about. So in this week's video, I'm going to be doing a quick physical overview and then lens test of this 28mm lens. But hang tight, because in my next two videos, I'm going to be doing the same overview and test of these much heftier and much more anamorphic 40 and 65mm lenses. So first, we're going to chat about this lens on like a physical level, what's going on with the build and the barrel design. And then we're going to shift more into some optics stuff, talking about those cylindrical elements up in here, coverage on different cameras and formats and all that. That's going to let us into some chart tests and some video tests, more for characteristic, yada yada. You know the deal. So with all that out of the way, let's dive into talking about this 28mm lens. And one thing I should just say, like right off the bat, in case you couldn't tell already, size-wise, this 28mm is considerably smaller than the 40 and 65mm from this set. The 40 and 65mm are large and bulky, typical of a fast, almost 2x stretch factor anamorphic prime. And then the 28mm, just a slightly slower T2.2, yet still 1.8x stretch, is just like an averagely sized lens. Maybe if it did have that flat T2 aperture, it would be a bit larger in diameter, but it's not. And that's not a bad thing, it just doesn't really match the set in terms of form factor at all, which can sometimes pose a bit of a hassle, maybe just with like accessories. It's just something to consider there. Lengthwise, it's just about 4¼ inches off of the camera body when attached. A little longer if you count the bayonet, obviously. And its widest diameter on the barrel is 80mm. And you can really tell when they're all next to each other like this, how much this 28mm stands out in size. The 28mm weighs a very reasonable 1.58 pounds, which again, the 40 and 65mm each are gonna weigh more than double that. So just given its smaller size, that can actually be kind of nice, because you're going to be able to treat it more like a normal lens. For example, it has a 77mm front thread, which is a very common thread, so if you didn't want to bust out the matte box for this thing, you didn't necessarily have to. And the size of this lens is not going to necessitate lens support at all for the sake of your camera body either. So barrel design kind of falls under that too. It's very typical, nothing crazy going on here. It just kind of gradually steps up at a few points throughout the lens, and then it just levels off nicely at the end for an inch or so. Each of these Vazen primes are laid out in more or less this way too. Very standard. Goes the lens mount, aperture ring, and then some sort of step up in diameter to a nice large focus ring. And on the 28mm, it gives you these imperial measurements on both sides of the geared ring and on opposite sides of the barrel. And then it just sort of like steps up to this last part where we get the make and model decals with the block of lens info, one on each side, and the Vazen logo on the top facing side here, where I think it would have gone maybe one on each side too, like the other lenses, if they had more real estate to work with. And that Vazen logo is in this awesome, like vibrant blood orange color, which is the same color that all the lens marking distances are in too. And other than that, this lens info on the side and the focus and iris markers are white. Also, every geared ring on each of these lenses in this set are the standard 32 pitch 0.8 MOD, and the iris ring takes about a 90-degree turn over its whole range, and that's the same for the 40 and 65s. Although the focus ring on the 28mm throws roughly 120 degrees over its whole focal range, but the 40 and 65mm take a much more standard 300-degree turn over their whole throw. So that's just one thing I kind of wanted to mention, like with this lens being a set, it could be a little problematic switching between the 65, 40 in the 28mm. The focusing radius is different between these 28 and the 40 and 65. The gears don't line up too, so you'd have to shuffle around those motors. You're gonna have to do a lot of little adjustments every time you switch lenses. So that's why I bring something up like that, because you kind of want them to have that cohesiveness. But anyways, with that out of the way, let's talk about some more juicy stuff, the optics and what's going on inside this lens, the stuff that matters. Obviously, these are anamorphic lenses. More specifically, these Vazen anamorphics are front anamorphics, meaning that group of cylindrical elements is basically at the frontmost point of the lens, the light's entrance point of the lens, rather than any other part. And those elements are the elements responsible for this 1.8x stretch ratio of the image, which is the ratio for producing 2.39:1 widescreen images from a 4:3 sized sensor, and we'll talk more about illumination and coverage in a second. And on the 28mm, this front group is housed inside this little like square window here on the front of the lens, which is kind of neat. But now let's take a look at the rear element in the flange here for a second. The 28mm exit pupil is quite small, and it does travel the very slightest bit when racking focus. Also, you notice there are no contacts here on the lens mount. There's going to be no lens camera communication going on whatsoever, and I feel like I shouldn't have to mention this, but I will anyways. These lenses do not autofocus, don't stabilize. There's absolutely nothing electronic going on in these whatsoever, all mechanical. It has a 10 aperture blade diaphragm that allows it to close to T16 and open up to T2.2. Again, just a hair slower than the T2 of its older twin brothers here in this set. The coatings going on these lenses are going to play a pretty significant role in the final image that you get. And if you just take a look down the barrel, you'll see that it is pretty sufficiently coated with a nice royal blue, almost cyan coating. And this is actually when I found out Vazen makes each one of these focal lengths in an amber flare version as well. So I can only assume that those coatings in there would be a more like orange, sort of goldish color that would give you that type of flare, but I actually haven't seen them yet. I would be really curious to do a test between an amber flare and a blue flare version. But at least we will be checking out the lens flare from this 28mm in just a sec when we do those video tests. This 28mm has a minimum focus distance of just about 33 3/4 inches from the front element, so just a few inches short of 3 feet. So not excellent, but it's pretty rare for an anamorphic lens to have a really good close focus distance, so I'll take it. Last note about optics, and then we're gonna dive into some of these video tests. I just wanted to mention something about coverage. Things can definitely get weird when you're talking about anamorphic lenses, and things get even more problematic the wider you get. And there's definitely some stuff to hash out with this 28mm coverage. So straight from the 28mm product page on Vazen's website, they say it produces a cinematic 2.39:1 aspect ratio image when capturing with 4:3 micro four thirds sensors like the GH5 and Zcam E2. It also works very well with the 4:3 1.8x Anamorphic mode in RED Komodo, with mild vignetting in the 6K mode and no vignetting in 4K. So obviously I had to test this out and found out, yes, in the Komodo's 6K 4:3 1.8x Anamorphic mode at f2.2, a very minimal vignette is present in the corners, but as you stop down further, that vignette grows and grows, and right around T5-6, you can actually see that the edges start to vignette a bit, and this becomes quite prominent when we are closed all the way down to T16. So slight vignette, yes, but only below, let's say, like T4. Above that, it is not slight. And just for kicks, I really wanted to see what the difference was when shooting in the 3:2 mode rather than the 4:3. And size-wise, you actually don't lose any image height here. You just gain a lot of area on these sides, which we already know this is going to reveal the vignetting much more. So already wide open at T2.2, there is a considerable vignette, but it's still spherical. Now, it's only until about T4 that those side vignettes come into play, so pretty much a full stop earlier than the 4:3 test. And all the way down at T16, you can now see how bad that vignetting gets, and you're literally just like looking at the housing around the front elements, so that's not going to work. Okay, so now let's check out this quick test I set up to get more of like a sense of the characteristic of this 28mm. And I actually did do this test in the 3:2 size from the Komodo, just so we can see the very most illumination possible from this lens, even though it's the improper format. So I am just gonna drop some faint line markers here to keep a reminder of where the 4:3 image size is. So I'm just gonna check out T2.2 here and then drop down to T5.6 to see how that tames things down a little bit. But basically here I have my very good and patient friend Kyle at about 4 feet 3 inches from camera and a roll of film at the close focus point about 2 feet 10 inches. I have a short string of lights at the backdrop about 12.5 feet away maybe, and a string of shiny garland stretching from that light in the back to pretty much right behind the camera, so the whole focus range. So I'll basically just rack to a few of the points in this image and then do a large pan from side to side. So first thing I noticed, sharpness in the corners is going to be pretty rough at T2.2 wide open. That film canister is pretty much as good as it gets there. You're gonna have to take my word for it. And as I rack to and from that film canister, I'm for sure noticing some lens breathing going on too. Although it looks pretty well maintained, it could be worse. Something else that stands out to me is how the focus plane affects those lens flares. They shift around quite a bit when you rack in and out, and it kind of gets like sharp when I focus it at the light. Also, before I even start to pan, just looking at the color grid on the back, you can get a pretty decent idea of the barrel distortion going on at 28mm here. Although the distortion of Kyle's face doesn't really get too bad until we're getting towards the edge of the image, pretty much right at like the third of the frame. And as we get back to the center here, I kind of just love how that lens flare sort of shifts around into place. It's really characteristic of what you think of for an anamorphic lens, so bravo to Vazen there, honestly. And pretty much I'm gonna do that same pan but at close focus so we can more easily focus on those lens flares and the out of focus area. Notice how the bokehs from the string lights shift in shape quite a bit, and also how we get this little full spectrum bloom to form at the flare while we're at wide open, and that's something you only get at T2.2 on this lens. So speaking of that, here's the same test at T5.6, just so we can get an idea of how stopping down affects things here. Here, like I said, is where the side vignetting becomes a problem, which is definitely what you're seeing here, and just remember those 4:3 markers on the side. And things are definitely sharper here, yes, and an increased depth of field helps as well. Now when we go over to our close focus point, it's actually quite clear and legible. And also notice how the bokehs don't get all funky at T5.6 like they did at T2. So let's check out those bokehs anyways though. Here I'm just gonna go through the whole aperture range, pausing at each stop, and I also have a window zoomed in at 300% here on that light and some of those string lights. And here is just a toggle between wide open T2.2 and T2.8, just to see the difference there in being wide open and being slightly off wide open. Mainly it's just that little extra bloom it gets off the bright light in the background like I was mentioning earlier. And you just get some really faint, full spectrum flares if you look closely. It's really nice. And finally here I just killed some of the other lights and panned this Felix light in the background a little so we can really isolate that lens flare and see what it's doing. All right, everybody, that is pretty much going to do it on this video overviewing this 28mm T2.2 1.8x Anamorphic Prime for RF. And make sure to stick around for the next 2 weeks of videos where I'll be doing the same test for the 40mm and 65mm. Let me know in the comments section what you liked from this lens or what you didn't like. I want to hear about it. And also, if you happen to like this video, hit it with that little thumbs up button down there to let me know you liked it. And if you're not already, subscribe to the channel. We are rocketing towards that 100,000 subscriber milestone, so every single sub helps. If you are subscribed, mwah, chef's kiss. You can also hit that little bell button that's next to the subscribe button. That's going to keep you in the loop whenever we post new content, which is every week. And again, those next 2 weeks of content are going to be for this awesome 40 and 65mm Vazen 1.x primes. So, people, take it easy, and we'll see you in the next one.